Picture a queue, not at a checkout, not at a gate at the airport. A line of human beings standing completely still, in wind, at 28,000 feet, each of them burning through bottled oxygen they cannot replace, waiting for their turn on a single rope. The line is not moving, and every person in it has already paid, in money and in years of wanting it, for exactly this place in it. This is the story of the deadliest day the world's highest mountain had ever seen, and of the one rule that was supposed to prevent it. The rule fit in a sentence. It was written into the plan, briefed in the tents, repeated on the radios. And on the 10th of May, 1996, almost everybody on the mountain who mattered decided, one by one, and for the best reasons in the world, that today it did not quite apply to them. By the middle of the 1990s, Everest had become a product. For $65,000, a commercial expedition would take a client with modest experience and put them on top of the world. The ropes fixed, the camps stocked, the oxygen carried, the way up decided. Underneath every one of those expeditions stood the same foundation: Sherpa climbers, the strongest people on the mountain, who carried the loads, fixed the lines, and broke the trail for wages that would not cover a client's boots, and who would be climbing into the storm at the end of this story when nobody else could. The best of these companies was run by a New Zealander named Rob Hall, a tall, methodical guide who had stood on the summit 4 times and brought every client he had ever taken up back down alive. His competitor that season was an American named Scott Fischer, charismatic, strong as anyone on the mountain, building a rival business on the same slope. On the same morning in May, both of their teams left the highest camp for the top. The mountain above that camp is called the Death Zone, and the name is not drama, it is arithmetic. Above roughly 26,000 feet, there is a third of the oxygen there is at the sea. The body cannot digest food, cannot heal, cannot think clearly, and cannot stop dying. Everything a climber does up there is done on a countdown that started the moment they left the tents. Bottled oxygen slows the countdown. Nothing stops it, which is why the rule existed and why it was so simple. Be on the summit by 2 o'clock in the afternoon or turn around. Not because 2 o'clock is dangerous, but because of what 2 o'clock buys you, the hours of daylight and bottled air it takes to get back down to the tents before the mountain's afternoon weather arrives. Hall himself put it plainly, in words his clients repeated afterwards. With enough determination, any fool can get up this hill. The trick is to get back down alive. The summit day began before midnight. 30-some climbers from 3 expeditions moving up the same fixed line under headlamps. And almost immediately, the plan began to leak time. At 2 of the steepest passages, the ropes that should have been fixed in advance were not there, and the guides had to stop and rig them while a queue formed behind, in the wind, in the death zone, everyone's regulators hissing away the margin. An hour went, then most of another. The arithmetic that the whole plan depended on was being spent by people standing still. The 2 o'clock rule now had its test. A handful of climbers looked at their watches, did the arithmetic, and turned around short of the summit of the world. It is worth saying plainly what that cost them: $65,000, months of their lives, and the one ambition they had organized years around, given up an hour from the top because a number said so. They lived. Nobody remembers their names. Almost everyone else kept climbing. The first summits came in the early afternoon, then the next wave, and the next. Past 2 o'clock, past 3. Rob Hall stood on top and waited there, in the thinnest air on earth, for the last of his clients. A mailman named Doug Hansen, who had turned around 300 feet short of this summit the year before, and whom Hall had personally talked into coming back for a second try. Hansen reached the top after 4 o'clock, more than 2 hours past the deadline, so depleted he could barely stand. The strongest guide on the mountain and the most spent client on it now had to descend the highest ridge on Earth together, at the exact hour the rule existed to keep empty. The storm was not a freak. It was an ordinary Everest afternoon blizzard, the kind the 2 o'clock rule was written about, arriving on schedule into a mountain still covered with people. Snow erased the way down. Wind erased the tracks. Darkness did the rest. On the open shoulder below the ridge, a group of climbers who had summited late wandered blind, a few hundred yards from their tents, until they simply sat down together in the snow to wait for a break in the weather that their oxygen would not outlast. Near midnight, the sky tore open for a few minutes, just enough to show them the stars and the lights of the camp, and the ones who could still stand were led stumbling toward the tents. The ones who could not stand stayed where they sat. That is the whole cruelty of altitude in one sentence. The huddle did not divide into brave and afraid. It divided into those whose legs still worked and those whose legs did not. Scott Fischer never made it back to the tents either. He had spent the season carrying his company on his back, hauling loads and sick clients up and down the mountain, and he had started summit day already running on fumes. He summited late, faded on the descent, and stopped a few hundred meters above the camp where the storm pinned him. The strongest man on the mountain in the brochure photographs died of the arithmetic like everyone else. What happened through that night is best told as a ledger. The Russian guide Anatoly Bakrev, who had descended ahead of the storm and would be argued about for years because of it, went out from the tents into the blizzard alone 3 separate times and dragged 3 climbers back alive. Nobody else could stand. Higher up, Rob Hall stayed with Doug Hansen at the top of the steepest pitch on the mountain, refusing for hours to leave him. Hansen died in the night. Hall's other guide, a young New Zealander named Andy Harris, climbed back up toward them into the storm and was never found. By morning, Hall was alone at the south summit, his hands ruined by frostbite, his oxygen gone, 28,000 feet in the sky, and still answering his radio. All day the mountain listened to him fade. 2 Sherpas climbed toward him and were beaten back by the wind at the last pitch. And in the evening, base camp did the only thing left. They patched his radio through a satellite to a phone in New Zealand, to his wife, Jan Arnold, 7 months pregnant with their first child. They talked about the name they would give their daughter. He told her not to worry too much. He said, "Sleep well, my sweetheart." Then the radio went quiet. He is on the mountain still. 8 people died in those 36 hours on both sides of the mountain. A Japanese climber named Yasuko Namba, who hours earlier had become the oldest woman ever to finish the 7 great summits, died in the huddle on the open shoulder. And a Texas pathologist named Beck Weathers, blinded by the altitude, was twice examined where he lay in the snow and twice judged beyond saving, because on that mountain, on that night, carrying him was impossible, and triage is not cruelty, it is altitude. The following afternoon, a day after being left, Weathers opened his eyes, stood up out of the snow on his own, and walked into camp with his arms frozen in front of him. He lost his right hand, most of his left, and his nose, and he went home. Here is the postmortem. The rope delays cost hours, but delays can be survived by turning around. The storm killed, but the storm was ordinary, and the rule existed precisely because Such storms are ordinary. The thing that actually failed on Everest was the rule itself, and it failed for the most human reason there is. It had no enforcement except character, and it was up against $65,000 a head, clients who had bet their identities on the summit, and guides whose next season depended on this season's success rate. A safety rule that costs that much to obey and costs nothing to break until it costs everything is not a system. It is a hope. The mountain enforced what the market would not. The commercial machine the disaster exposed did not stop. It grew. In 2019, a photograph went around the world showing the summit ridge of Everest with a standing queue of hundreds, parka to parka, on the fixed line, in the death zone, waiting. People called the picture unbelievable. It was not. It was the same queue this story began with, grown longer, because every incentive that built the first one is still being paid. The 2 o'clock rule is still briefed in the tents, and it is still, in the end, voluntary. 2 of the survivors wrote books about that day, and the books fought each other over who had done what, while the record was still warm. But the postmortem writes itself. The only question is whether anyone reads it before the next one.